In this video, we're going to be going over the Chapter 5 quiz. The first thing we want to do is talk about some formulas as they relate to CVP, cost, volume, profit analysis. The first thing we're going to talk about is sales. In order to calculate sales, you're going to take the quantity sold times the selling price, and that will give you your sales. The next thing we want to talk about is variable costs. In order to calculate your variable costs, you're going to take your quantity sold times your variable cost per unit, and that will give you your variable costs. Next, we'll talk about contribution margin, which can actually be calculated a couple different ways. One way to do it is to take your sales minus your variable costs. That'll give you your contribution margin. Or you can take quantity sold times the contribution margin per unit to get your contribution margin. How do you get the contribution margin per unit? You simply take the selling price minus the variable costs per unit. Next, we'll talk about the contribution margin ratio. Contribution margin ratio can be calculated a couple different ways also. One way is to take the contribution margin, divide that by the sales. That'll give you your contribution margin ratio. Another way to do that would be to take the contribution margin per unit and divide that by the selling price. Either way, you're going to get your contribution margin ratio. And finally, to talk about net operating income. Net operating income is the bottom line of what we call the contribution income statement. That contribution income statement, we're going to start with sales, subtract out your variable costs, and you'll get your contribution margin. The contribution margin, that's the amount of money that we have in order to apply and cover our fixed costs. Once you have paid your fixed costs, what's going to be left is your net operating income, which we can also call profit. Next, we're going to move down to question 2 on the quiz, which talks about the break-even point. The break-even point is the place where you break even. You don't make money, you don't lose any money. It's the point at which profit is zero. We can describe this as units sold. How many units do we have to sell in order to break even? Or we can talk about it in the form of sales dollars. What do our sales dollars have to be in order for us to break even? Moving on to question 3. Question 3 deals with the margin of safety. It's actually a quite simple concept. You're going to take your actual units sold and subtract out your break-even units sold. Or you're going to take your actual sales dollars and subtract out your break-even sales dollars. In other words, how much can our sales go down in either units or dollars and we'll still break even? What is our margin of safety before we start losing money? Moving on to question number 4. Before we get started on question 4, I wanted to review something I call the grid. Instead of memorizing all the formulas, you can use this grid to solve almost any CVP problem. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a contribution income statement. And we say that sales minus your variable costs is going to give you your contribution margin. This is the amount of money we have to cover fixed expenses, and what's left over after that is your profit or net operating income. The formula for calculating sales, we have to take the quantity sold times the selling price. The selling price will almost always be given to you. That will give you your sales. For variable cost, you have to take the quantity sold times the variable cost per unit, which will also almost always be given to you, and that'll give you your variable cost. Another way to calculate the contribution margin is to take the quantity sold times the contribution margin per unit, and you can get that by taking the selling price minus the variable cost per unit. Fixed cost will also almost always be given to you. Using this grid, you can solve just about any one of the problems that we have for CVP. Going back to number 4, it says Regional Ink sells product PDQ for $120 per unit. So that's your selling price. So you can fill that in to your grid. Variable costs are $70 per unit. That's your variable cost per unit. You can fill that in on your grid. And the total fixed costs are $700,000. Once again, fill that in on your grid. How many units must Regional Ink sell to make a profit of $720,000? So they're telling you what the profit is. So you just have to fill that in on the grid. And then you can back into the contribution margin. If you think about it this way, X minus 700 equals 720. So you can calculate a contribution margin of 1420 in order to get a profit of 720,000. Well, that's great. You can calculate the contribution margin per unit by taking the selling price minus the variable cost per unit, and you end up with a contribution margin per unit of 50. Using a little bit of algebra, we can take the quantity sold, which is our unknown, times 50, which is our contribution margin per unit, will give us a contribution margin of 1,420,000. Using some algebra, isolate the variable on one side, you end up with 1,420,000 divided by 50. You have to sell 28,400 units in order to have a profit of 720,000. You can do the same thing with this concept called break even. Just fill in what they tell you. So they're telling you that the profit is 0. They told you that the fixed expenses were 700. So how much does your contribution margin need to be in order for you to break even? Well, it has to be 700,000. We know that the contribution margin per unit is 50. So once again, just use your algebra, and you've got Q times 50 equals 700,000. Isolate the Q, 700,000 divided by 50 will give you 14,000 units to break even.
In question number 5, we're going to talk about two of probably the easiest concepts in this chapter, and that's margin of safety and profit. Please do not overthink these two concepts. Margin of safety is how much can your sales go down and you still not lose any money. So think about it this way. If your actual sales are 240,000 units and you break even when you sell 100,000 units, the difference between those two, 240 minus 100, is 140,000 units. You can go down 140,000 units and still break even. That's your margin of safety in units. You could also talk about margin of safety in dollars. So if you take your actual units, which was the 240, and you multiply that by the selling price, you'll get your sales. So in this case, Deli Ink sells product YIL for $220 per unit. So that's the selling price. Take the selling price of 220, multiply that by the actual units, and you get your actual sales. If you take that same $220 selling price and multiply that by the 100,000 units that you break even at, you'll end up with your break-even sales of $22 million. And then you simply take your actual sales minus your break-even sales, and that gives you your margin of safety, but this time it is in dollars. So you've got a break-even of 140,000 units or $30,800,000. Another way to think about that is up here we calculated the break-even units. And if you multiply that by the selling price, you'll end up with the same number. The final concept here for Chapter 5, Question 5 quiz, is this concept of profit, which is simply your sales minus your costs. We calculated the sales above here, took the actual units times the selling price, and they give you the total costs. So this includes the fixed and the variable components. So if you take your sales minus your costs, so your sales were $52,800,000 as calculated above, the costs are given to you at $2,200,000. Simply subtract those, and you end up with a profit of $50,600,000. The last question in the Chapter 5 quiz, question number 6, deals with what I call what-if analysis. It looks very complicated, but if you use the grid, you just put the pieces in place and everything seems to work out. Let's go through the question together real quick. It talks about this company called Lexus Inc. And they're considering changes to their promotional budget. These changes will increase fixed costs by $4,000. So they're probably going to spend $4,000 more maybe on an advertising plan. But it'll decrease their variable cost from $3.50 to $3. So fixed costs are going to go up, variable costs are going to go down. And we hope that by maybe doing more advertising or whatever this increased costs are, that our sales will go from $4,000 to $4,300. And so we give you some questions here. Assume the selling price stays at $10. So you go over and you set up your grid where you take your quantity sold times your selling price to get your sales. Your quantity sold times your variable cost per unit to get your variable costs. Your quantity sold times your contribution margin per unit to get your contribution margin. Well, they give you most of this information. They go ahead and they tell you that before the changes that your sales were 4,000 units. So we can just plug that in as our Q. Our Q is 4,000 units. They tell you that before the changes, the selling price was 10. So we can fill that in as our selling price at 10. They tell you that before the changes, your variable cost per units were $3.50. So we can fill that in. And then we can calculate our contribution margin per unit. Take the 10 minus the $3.50 and you get $6.50. Well, how do you figure out what your contribution margin is then? You just simply take the 4,000 times the $6.50 and you get a contribution margin of $26,000. Now what about the fixed costs? Well, they don't tell you where they started, but they do tell you how much they went up. So what I like to do is just take a reasonable number, so something that's maybe half of contribution margin, and plug that in as your original fixed cost. So I just took $10,000, but I want to make sure that in my second scenario that the fixed cost is $4,000 higher. We're just trying to figure out if we should do this or not. We're not trying to figure out how much the profit will or won't be. We're just trying to figure out if we should do this. In the second scenario, they tell you that the Q is 4,300. So we just plug 4,300 in as a Q in our second scenario. The selling price stays the same at 10, but the variable cost per unit goes down to 3. So we plug that in. And when you take the 10 minus the 3, you get 7. Take the 4,300 times the 7, you get a contribution margin of 30,100. If you subtract out a fixed cost that's 4,000 more than the first, so ours would have to be 14,000, you end up with profit of $16,100. So when you look at this, you say, okay, in the first scenario, we're going to have a profit of $16,000. But if we make these changes, we'll end up with a profit of $16,100. So it looks like we'll have more profit if we make these changes. So we should go ahead and do it. And you may be asking yourself, well, why would you spend $4,000 more just so you can have an extra $100 of profit? By spending $4,000, if you have an extra $100 of profit, you actually make $4,100. So anytime you can spend money and make more money, you should go ahead and do that. So how much will the profit change after making these changes? It's only going to go up $100, right? And will it go increase or decrease? Oh, it'll increase. And should the company do this? Yes, the company should do this because they make more money. Anytime you can make more money, go ahead and do it. We're not going to spend money to lose money, but we're spending money here to increase our profit by $100. And you can see that it doesn't really matter what fixed number you put in here, as long as the two fixed are 4,000 apart, the difference will still be $100. Once again, we're not trying to figure out what the profit is, we're trying to figure out what the difference is.